Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Criminal Justice Corner. Here at Criminal Justice Corner, we give you the real details surrounding the case, and just in case you find yourself in that same situation, we give you potential actionable advice so that you can potentially get yourself out of it. I am your host, Dr. Jennifer Matthews, and today I have with me a very special guest, McCracken Poston Jr. McCracken, can you give the audience a little bit of backstory about yourself?
Yes, everybody always wants to know about my name, McCracken Poston Jr. I was in third grade probably before I got up the nerve to ask my grandmother why she named my father McCracken King Poston. And he was born in rural Middle Tennessee,
Wow.
1923. My grandmother told me that in modern times he would be called a preemie. He was very
Okay.
small.
Yeah.
And the country doctor came around with the paperwork after the delivery
Yes.
and took one look at him and told my grandmother he's not going to make it. So he had the paperwork, so she decided to name him honorary family names. McCracken was her maiden name.
Okay.
King was her mother-in-law's maiden name,
Okay.
thinking that they would soon be on a tombstone. But my dad eked it out for 85 years. And I'm his sixth child, first son. So I
No
get it honest.
way.
Yeah, yeah.
So he was counted out before he even had a chance, literally.
That's exactly right.
What?
And I dedicate my book to my father because just writing it made me explore a lot of themes that had affected me in my life. And he was a very loving, wonderful father, but he suffered greatly from alcoholism.
Okay.
And I get into that because my sisters and I did an intervention with him about the time of this case.
Okay. Okay.
I was the lawyer for Alvin Ridley, unusual behaving, I should say non-typical behaving TV repairman.
Okay.
Zenith was a TV brand,
I
I'll tell
remember
younger.
Zenith way back
The
in
young-
the day. Yeah.
and
Way back in the day.
he was a franchisee of the Zenith brand.
Okay.
But his showroom was more like a concrete floor warehouse. It didn't have the beautiful
Layout.
fake living room setup.
Yes.
It was rough. But my dad always loved doing business with outsiders, and Alvin Ridley was one of those people. So we were his customers, which probably led to him seeking me out to represent him when he was accused of keeping his wife in the basement for 30 years and then killing her.
Now, did you know his wife?
Nobody knew his wife. Nobody knew that he had a wife. As a matter of fact, Ringgold, Georgia is known for really one thing.
Okay.
Dolly Parton slipped down from Nashville to get married here in 1966.
Okay.
We have a mural to Dolly Parton for the 90 minutes that she was in town.
That is amazing.
And, she recently lost her husband, Carl,
Yes.
which we all give our condolences for. But they came to Ringgold, Georgia to get married.
Yes.
Now, Ringgold is in the northwest corner of the state. Its proximity to Alabama, Tennessee, and North Carolina is almost immediate.
Okay.
Because Tennessee is not a very tall state, Virginia and Kentucky also had fairly easy access within a couple of hours of the South's quickie marriage capital.
Okay.
And that was because it was one-stop shopping. You could get your blood test, your license, and an officiant to conduct the wedding.
Okay.
So we had a lot of shotgun weddings, a lot of, doing the right thing weddings. But before Dolly Parton and Carl Dean married in May of 1966, 3 weeks later, this young couple, Alvin and Virginia Ridley,
Okay.
get married in Ringgold. But by the time George Jones and Tammy Wynette came to town in 1969
Okay.
to get married, Virginia was missing. This is a 1968 article that her parents had put in the paper
Okay.
that she's missing.
All right.
And 30 years later, in the supermarket tabloids, sicko holds wife hostage for 30 years, then kills her. That was in the supermarket aisle of every grocery store in the United States.
So this, of course, is before you wrote your book, right?
Well, absolutely. I didn't write my book until my book came out last February.
Okay, got it. Go
The
ahead.
trial, my representation of Alvin Ridley began informally in October of 1997, 4 days after Virginia's death.
Wow.
Alvin went to a phone booth, or a phone stand, and seemed to be reluctantly calling local government. Alvin Ridley had made himself an enemy of local government by just his behavior. He was a malcontent. He constantly was accusing everybody of running him out of business. And he started suing everybody. And at some point, somebody countersued
Okay.
and thought they got a judgment against him and had his van, a Chevy van, seized.
Okay.
Well, Alvin was obsessed about that van. That's all I could ever get him to talk about.
Was his vein?
And in his mind, everything looped back to the what he called the illegal seizure of his Chevy van.
So they did take it.
They did take it, but as I learned later, to my shock, it was only gone 3 weeks. But 15 years later, he was still obsessing over it.
Oh my
And when I would ask him questions about his wife, it would invariably loop back to the van.
No.
And so at some point, I was so frustrated, we would just yell at each other. And nothing was happening. He wasn't charged yet. And at some point, he mentions the van again, and our voices are escalating. And I said, "The van, oh Lord," just out of just an exclamation.
Yeah.
Alvin went silent. He thought I was praying. And he closed his eyes and clasped his hands together like a child would.
Because he's ready
And-
to pray with you.
And I noticed this, and I thought, I can work with this. So I ended up praying my legal advice to him at every meeting thereafter, because I could get him to shut up
Yes.
and listen for the first time. Now, did he act on my advice? No, but he at least listened to it.
I was just about to say, at least you got him to listen. And
Exactly.
that's big.
And so he was the most difficult client. And my book is about 15 months with an extremely difficult client who I began to realize was innocent.
Now, wait, my question is this, though. Because you knew Alvin prior to ever defending him, and you had, let's say, a cordial relationship with him, how did you never see his wife? Is it because you only seen him at the store, or how did that happen?
Listen, I was in government for a decade. I was either running for office or holding office. I was in the state legislature. I prided myself at age 28 to have won a state house seat by going to every door in town.
Okay.
That was a door that nobody ever came to. And as a matter of fact, there was kind of an imposing gate, an imposing homemade gate in the front. There was lots of no trespassing and keep out signs. And I knew that Alvin Ridley lived there. I had no idea that he had a wife.
Right.
And I never got to the door because of that gate. So nobody in town saw her for many, many years, almost
And
3
that was
decades.
going to be my next question. Did she
Her-
never leave the house? Did she never leave the house?
Apparently no. And that was
And
the
she
great
didn't use the
mystery.
phone? She didn't use the
Apparently not. What was
Okay.
What was fascinating about this woman was, and I'll give a little of the book away, 14 of the 15 months of representing Alvin Ridley were me pulling my hair out because we were zooming in on a trial. She had epilepsy. We were able to get her childhood records to prove that. Alvin said all along she had a spell, and by spell he meant a seizure. And my goal was to prove that that's what she died from, a seizure. Now, I had nothing to go on because thankfully death from epilepsy is somewhat rare. But here's a woman who clearly was not medicating for it. Fortunately, he never threw anything away, and so I had years and years of bottles of medicine, and then I had several months of full bottles of medicine. So she abruptly stopped taking her own medicine, and he kept getting it for her for several months. So she was a mystery. She was a true mystery, and making it more mysterious, my client wouldn't let me in his house. I decided that I would get a phone installed in his house so that he could call my Atlanta-based cell number that I had picked up when I was in the state legislature.
Okay.
And when I showed up with the phone guy, he immediately decided to have the phone installed on the outside porch of his house, just to keep me from coming in. And he let every cop in that ever wanted to go in, but he wouldn't let me. So the first break I got in the case was a tragic one, and one that is very sad to even talk about. Okay. But do you remember hearing about, you're so young, doctor, you were a child when this was going on. Okay. But do you remember the Olympic track star Florence Griffith Joyner?
Yes.
She went by FloJo. She
Absolutely.
Was a beautiful, stylish athlete.
Yeah.
She was known for her long painted fingernails.
Absolutely.
And
yes.
and she could run like the wind.
Yes.
And she died unexpectedly of a seizure. The state of Georgia was saying the markings on Virginia's under her eyes and around her mouth, what are called petechia, which are tiny broken blood vessels.
Yes.
That they were too much to be seizure related, so that therefore they figured Alvin must have suffocated her.
Right, I can see that.
Well, the tragedy of FloJo's death gave a gift to us, because Florence Griffith Joyner had a lot more of those things.
Okay.
And she had a world-class autopsy.
Wow.
Because she was the most famous female athlete in the world.
Absolutely.
And sadly, she was dogged by allegations of performance-enhancing drugs, people that wanted to deny her greatness. Her autopsy vindicated her. The long-term drug toxicology report indicated nothing stronger than Benadryl and Tylenol.
Wow.
In her system. And so she was vindicated in death, but she also her autopsy revealed what a slipshod autopsy the state of Georgia had done. And that was affected by the rumor about Virginia, right, that was delivered with the dead body to Atlanta when the medical examiner was told this woman has been kept in a basement for 30 years without anything but speculation.
Just because nobody had seen her.
Nothing but speculation. And so I think it pushed him toward a finding of homicide.
Right.
Well, the Florence Griffith Joyner autopsy clearly indicated that Virginia died of a seizure. But the other mystery was not resolved until just about 4 weeks before the trial, when my parents made an extra turkey plate on Thanksgiving of 1998.
Okay.
And then they told me, go take this to Mr. Ridley. Go take this to Alvin.
Did he let you in?
And that's the last thing I wanted to do.
Right.
Was go by and ram my head against a wall of him not accepting me. But right now, I was just doing a favor for my parents.
Right.
So I didn't call ahead. I knocked on the door. He came. And I later learned how transactional Alvin was, which your readers are going to pick up on Alvin's issues, I guarantee.
Okay.
But he was very transactional.
Yeah.
He sees me with this delicious meal in a brown paper bag, and he feels the need to give me something. Wow. And so he said, come on in.
Look at
that. Inside this house, when my eyes adjusted, on one wall were hundreds of handwritten notes and pages. Just about anything that would bear ink or pencil had this really pretty but very stylistic handwriting on it. I got excited. I said, Alvin, who wrote this? There were recipes, there were poems, there were talks about things going on in town. He said, well, Virginia did. And then I said, is there more? And he led me into another room where it was almost floor to ceiling in boxes and crates, her writings. Now, a lot of it was already deteriorated. It was not a pleasant house. Apparently, it was well kept when Virginia was alive, but since she died, Alvin was there alone, and he had a tendency of bringing home bags of fast food and not disposing of them properly, and so we had a vermin problem from the get-go.
No.
But I was so excited that I spent the next 4 days in a row. I came to that house in the morning and processed some of these writings.
Okay.
Well, I had no idea what they meant. I just knew that there was a happy woman that lived here.
Wow.
And by every indication, she was content. And then I found a couple that I called pure gold because she discussed her seclusion.
Really?
Self-imposed seclusion. She did not, she had occasionally reactions to her epilepsy medicine. And there was a writing in September of 1977 which said, God told me to stop taking my medicine.
Really?
Virginia had a lifetime of having occasional allergic reactions to the epilepsy medicines. And I think she just decided, I've had enough on it. I'll deal with the seizures. And that coincided with when the empty bottles ended and the full bottles resumed. Right at that time, September of 1977, Alvin continued to get her medicine until he was convinced she's just not going to take it.
Okay.
And so it was fascinating. I got so excited, but then Alvin said, you can't have it. That's all I've got left of her. And of course, I went into full prayer mode, except this time I was Ernest Angley, grabbing his hands and telling him, oh, Lord, tell your child, Alvin,
yes.
we've got to use these writings.
Right.
We have got to use these writings.
Yes.
Lord, Virginia is right next to you. Tell her to tell Alvin to use these writings.
Yeah.
And I guess I was so fervent in my prayer that he later came back with a counteroffer, which was for $200 he would let me copy them. And I thought, deal. because we'll work on getting the originals to the courthouse later.
Yeah.
Well, the compromise was Alvin would keep the originals.
Okay.
And out of 15,000 plus writings, I had a couple of hundred that I considered vital to the case because they talked about things going on in town. They talked about her seclusion. They talked about her not wanting to see her family anymore. You see, her family, in trying to flush her out in 1968,
okay,
they were pivotal to a 1970 eviction where they had the couple evicted trying to flush her out. She never forgave them. She never forgave them. And guess who she wrote from her seclusion in Ringgold, Georgia, about her eviction? President
Parton.
Richard Milhouse Nixon. She wrote to President Nixon, and he passed the buck to Housing and Urban Development, who passed the buck through the Georgia Senator Gambrell, who wrote Virginia back acknowledging that the letter had ended up now with him and that he told her it was a local matter that should be taken up with the local housing authority, which is not what she wanted to hear.
Right.
But what was fascinating was this mysterious woman who was supposed to be held in a basement, she was carrying on correspondence with presidents.
Right.
And senators. Alvin and Virginia, both, for every ounce of suspicion they had about local government, they had pounds of hope from the federal government.
Wow.
Which revived itself so many times during this representation, often to comic effect, because Alvin was continually trying to subvert me and go to the feds to get help. And it was just wild. Now, the epilepsy expert that I found was wonderful. Okay. His name was Braxton Bryant Wanamaker from Orangeburg, South Carolina. He's a neurologist. He was, at the time, the world's expert on dying with epilepsy.
Wow.
And I hired him, and he was an awkward man to talk to because he was so smart. And I was just flying by the seat of my pants with this client. And so I took him out to dinner the night before, and it was a very awkward conversation. And then at the very end, the restaurant is closing. He said, "Is there anything else unusual about this woman?" And I said, "Yeah, she couldn't burp without noting it on a piece of paper." And he said, "Oh, that's hypergraphia." He said, "It happens with temporal lobe epilepsy sometimes."
Wow.
He said, "I've got clients that..." My whole reason for getting him was to talk about the petechia, the hemorrhaging on the face.
Yes.
And here is this gift that he's giving me to explain the
writing.
Why did she write so much? And he said it doesn't affect what she writes. It just compels her to write it. And so it was an incredible coming together of evidence and information at the last minute. But Alvin was already taking legal advice from somebody else.
The government.
He was taking legal advice from a guy who rode around on his bicycle with a white beard selling items out of catalogs in his bicycle basket.
So
he was known locally as Salesman Sam, and Salesman Sam felt like he was Alvin's legal advisor. So I had to deal with that.
Yes.
And so I already felt relegated to second chair in this trial, even though Salesman Sam could not practice law.
Exactly. He couldn't come to the courtroom.
And he was a witness. And he was a witness, so I wouldn't let him in the courtroom, which was strategy.
Exactly.
But then the day before the end of the trial, Jesus appeared to Alvin during lunch and ordered him to testify.
Oh, my word.
Well, I had not prepared Alvin to testify because every time I ever talked to Alvin about his dear departed wife, he wanted to talk about that van.
No, not the van.
And so I just thought that would sound so cold and detached. I'm just not going to. Yeah. I'm going to suggest that he not testify.
Right.
But when Jesus ordered him to, of course, it's always Alvin's right to testify.
Absolutely. So he had to get
It's
up
a constitutional right.
Yes.
And it's a constitutional right to remain silent. It was his call, and Alvin did beautifully.
Really?
The Atlanta Journal-Constitution reporter Jack Warner wrote something to the effect of, Alvin Ridley finally took the stand he's been trying to take for 30 years.
Wow.
And that's because in all of Alvin's civil litigation, it all got dismissed before it ever got to a trial. And so he finally did get to take the stand, and I let him just roll out everything, every conspiracy. And at some point, the jurors were kind of entertained by it. And I thought, the jurors are laughing, and this is a murder trial.
Right.
This is not the worst situation I've ever been in law. And so I'm just going to leave it up to your readers to
finish.
Hopefully I've piqued your curiosity. I'm excited to this is June 25th when we're recording this.
June 25th of 2025. Where can they get your book, Zenith Man? Where can they find this book?
You can order it from just about anywhere. But it is they need to use the full title. Someone wrote a fictional account of our trial, changing our names.
What?
And everything, but they used the same title. New Line Cinema, I had given them this title when there was a film project that never came through.
Okay.
But I retained literary rights to the title, but there is no copyright in titles. So somebody else wrote a Zenith Man book, a short fictionalized account of this. Okay. Very short. My book is a full book, 320 pages. It's half the trial, and that's from transcript. And that's some of the funniest part of the book, is what people were actually saying. Now, what I'm excited about, I was in New York last week.
Okay.
I did an event at the KGB bar in Lower East Side, and it was packed.
Wow.
And I was at Thriller Fest, where I got to meet one of my heroes.
Okay, who is that?
Mr. John Grisham.
Wow, look at that picture. John Grisham himself.
He was speaking at Thriller Fest, and what's funny about John Grisham, and I've always admired him.
Yes.
John Grisham and I both grew up in the northwest corners of our states, Georgia and Mississippi.
Okay.
Me and him. We are both very close to the Tennessee state line. We both, as teenagers, worked patching potholes in this hot southern sun. We both went to law school in our respective states, and we both served in the state legislatures of our respective states.
So you guys have a lot of parallels.
And so I reminded him at the event in front of about 250 people. I listed all those similarities off, and then, of course, self-depreciatingly to myself, I said at the end, and we both wrote our first books about local murder trials. Wow. A Time to Kill was his.
Yes.
Zenith Man was mine. And then I had this pause, and I said, so what are we going to do next?
And what did he say?
Of course, he's got 50 books ahead of me that are all like bestsellers. So he laughed out loud, and we all had a good laugh.
Yeah.
But I really do appreciate the fact that he was so kind.
Yes.
But while I was in New York, my book hit #1 again.
Look at
in
that.
In the Amazon category of books about persons with disabilities.
Look at that.
It also got down to #4 in the ebook All Biographies and Memoirs. For that to happen after 16 months
Yes.
after publication, that's hopefully that this book is becoming an evergreen title.
Yes.
Because it has universal themes
Yes.
of misunderstandings, and misjudgments. I hinted that my book is very popular in books about persons with disabilities.
Yes.
I later learned that Alvin has a disability.
Okay.
I'm going to let your readers figure it out.
Yeah.
The ones who are familiar with this developmental disability, they will recognize it page 1.
Okay.
Because I had to write it from my information mindset
time.
in 1997 through 99. And because I did not understand him. And when we learned just 5 years ago of his disability, it formed the book in my head immediately because I knew now I could explain Alvin.
Yes.
But I also apologized to him. I apologized to him. I said, Alvin, we just weren't processing each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is not your fault. Alvin's last few years, he just passed a year ago almost, July 2nd of 2024.
Okay.
His last months were the happiest I'd ever seen him.
Wow.
He and I maintained a weekly lunch for over 20 years.
Wow.
And he needed some help navigating the world. And myself and my secretary of the last 15 years, Carlene, we just kind of looked out for him.
Yeah.
When he needed a car, we showed him how to use Facebook Marketplace and CarMax. CarMax he thought was the model of the Kia Soul that I convinced him to get. And so he always called it his CarMax car.
Oh my gosh.
So Alvin was a daily challenge, but he was also a daily joy. He was a truly loving, caring person who had been made the boogeyman.
Yeah.
He had been made the boogeyman by our community.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, I was afraid of him too at first.
Yeah. You had to get to know him.
You had to get to know him.
Yeah.
And there are millions of people in this world, in this country,
Yes.
that are undiagnosed who could suffer the same misunderstandings and misjudgment that Alvin suffered. But I'll let your readers, they can do a little research on the book and figure it out. But I hope that they will read it.
I'm sure. It sounds very intriguing. So I'm sure they'll be able to get the book and draw their own conclusions, like you said, especially about the disability portion. But
I hope they'll review it too, because reviewing kind of is like fuel to the big booksellers. They realize
they gotta drop the reviews.
People like this book. We're gonna feature it, or we're gonna push it out there a little bit more.
Exactly. Now, I always like to leave my readers with tips so that they can get something out of this podcast and use it in their daily lives. What would be a tip that you would leave for the listeners?
Well, don't judge a person until you really get to know them.
I like that.
I would say don't judge a book by the cover, but that's actually Alvin in Virginia at a local amusement park in 1966.
Look at that.
Hamming it up for the photo strip, those little booths,
Yeah, I love those.
And there's another picture from the strip on the inside of the book. I just wish that police and lawyers and judges had better training on how to deal with a wide range of issues that they could encounter in defendants.
I am such a proponent for training, so I definitely agree with you there. Those are really good tips that I think the audience can benefit from. So, McCracken, I want to thank you so very much for being my very special guest today, and I want to urge all of the listeners to go out and get your book, Zenith Man, everywhere books are sold. I'm sure they're going to love it, and don't forget to drop a review.
Again, the one with the kissing couple, and the full title is Zenith Man, Death, Love, and Redemption in a Georgia Courtroom.
There you go.
I had to give it a subtitle to distinguish it from the other title.
Yes. So the whole title. So make sure you get the right book. And you're welcome to come back anytime, especially if you get a second book like you and John Grisham were talking about. So you can come back and talk about that.
By the way, your listeners may think, I've heard that guy's voice before, or I've heard that guy's name before.
Okay.
The #1 Apple podcast last summer
Okay.
was called Noble.
Okay.
And it was about the tri-state crematory controversy in Georgia.
Okay.
The case with over 330 dead bodies that were not properly cremated, but they were stacked and stored. And
I remember seeing that.
it was a huge case.
I remember
It was a
that.
huge case, but the Noble podcast did a wonderful job. Well, I come in about episode 4
Really?
as the hapless lawyer in the case. Yes, that was
Really?
my case as well.
Really?
So
Who
a
did you
lot of people
represent?
I represented the crematory operator and ultimately his whole family, because there was a lot of pressure to charge everyone. And I was successfully defended 3 family members, and successfully, I'd call it success, since the state was seeking 8,000 years in prison, and I'm not exaggerating. The way they charged him, potential was over 8,000 years in prison.
Okay.
And I got him 12.
That is a success. That is definitely a success.
And he is a wonderful client, and one that I think was affected by mercury poisoning. But I'll let people decide that on their own. Everybody has an opinion about it.
Yeah,
but
I remember seeing that documentary.
Yeah,
Wow.
it is what it is.
Yeah.
But that's where some of your listeners may think, I've heard of a McCracken Poston before.
Yeah.
Or, I've heard
yeah.
that voice
So look,
before.
maybe that could be your next book. It was pretty salacious.
I don't want to give anything away.
Okay, well, that's my suggestion. I'll say that. That's my suggestion. I'll leave it at that.
Doctor, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And I want to thank all of the listeners. If you have not already done so, please like, subscribe, and share. Tell a friend to tell a friend about Criminal Justice Corner, and we will see you on the next episode. Thank you.
Thank you.